Hey there everybody, and welcome back to d&Ddoge. I peruse around the internet to find some stories of D&D cringe, and oh boy, do we have a few stories for you today. But before we get into that, we have a like and comment kitty doubleheader with Lucky and Nipsey. They are certainly best buds. But with that out of the way, let's get right into these D&D horror stories. Skunked by Anonymous. This tale of mild woe comes from an Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition game during my college years. Take as a vignette of how not to GM a game. Though the party was quite large, only 3 people factored prominently in the story: the Dungeon Master, DM from now on, Druid, and Kender. It's long, and there will be a TLDR at the end. Prior to this campaign, DM had been a milquetoast player in several Advanced Dungeons & Dragons games, always choosing support roles. DM's characters were bland, and mildly utilitarian, so it took our social circles by surprise when DM started asking people to join their high-level power campaign. I almost passed on the invitation, but due to various forever GMs graduating and tabletop RPGs being eaten alive by Magic the Gathering and the local vampire LARP, I found myself with no better game to play during that time slot. So I joined the party. Each player was told some rules for point buying stats, and given an XP total for classes and magic items, with carte blanche to make their characters from existing Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition rulebooks. Kender was one of those people that everyone likes. Completely chill, zero malice, and fun to joke with at the table. Their character for the campaign was a stereotypical Kender from Dragonlance, essentially a Tasselhoff Burrfoot clone. DM stated that Kender had the coolest character in the party. Then there was Druid. Druid was a self-avowed, min-maxing power gamer, and they were good at it. They were one of the forever GMs on campus, with a reputation for running truly high-power games, which were both balanced and fun, but definitely not to everyone's tastes. When DM asked them to play, Druid specifically asked if DM was okay with them min-maxing their character, and DM said, yes, please do. So Druid made their Druid, who was a better cleric than the cleric, a better magic user than the magic user, and had a reliable damage output that equaled or exceeded my fighter. And as for me, I decided to relax and play a 100% stereotypical dwarven fighter, complete with the thickest armor possible and a dwarven thrower hammer. The campaign started, and we met at an inn, headed to the castle, and received our quest from the good ruler of the land. And the party went off to slay evil, roll dice, and generally have a good time. Unfortunately, as the games progressed, we began to see a pattern in encounters. Kender always seemed to be placed at the center of the show. NPCs would think Kender was cute, and so Kender would always be able to convince them to do what the party needed. If Kender taunted an NPC, things would always seem to work out. Combat also seemed to follow a pattern. The monsters would somehow surprise most of the party, except the Kender, who always seemed to be able to slip into the shadows and begin working around behind the monsters. The monsters would then attack the rest of the party, especially my fighter, who would soak damage for a couple of rounds until he dropped. Druid would be blasting away at the monsters in true min-maxer style, dropping them in hordes, until Kender got around behind the boss monster. The requisite backstab happened, and the boss died. Druid would help finish up the encounter, while the cleric got me back on my feet. This happened again, and again, and again. Things got so monotonous that one of the players dropped out due to boredom. And then there was the treasure distribution. The DM tended to leave magic items that were clearly meant for specific players. After each major encounter, 2 or 3 players would get permanent items, while the rest of the party got consumables such as potions and scrolls, and gold, which had no significant meaning as we had more gold than we could use. and weren't able to buy magic items. If the players weren't dividing the loot as the DM wanted, DM would chime in with helpful hints, and Kender always seemed to be one of the players who received a permanent item. After a few weeks of play, things were coming to a head. DM loved having Kender backstab things, and so was giving strength-enhancing items to Kender so they could do more damage. A lot of the party were grumbling about this pattern, as they were being left further and further behind. The only people not grumbling were Kender and their significant other, and Kender always had this guilty look on their face when DM handed them yet another power boost. Recently, Kender had been given a Girdle of Giant Strength, but DM decided Kender needed more, and so this week's treasure included another, stronger Girdle of Giant Strength. The treasure discussion went something like this. Me. I'd like the Girdle of Giant Strength. It would greatly improve my fighting abilities. Druid. Makes sense. Kender. Yep, I'm cool with that. Rest of the party. Okay. DM. Well, I was thinking that Kender could get this new girdle and give the dwarf their old one. That way they would have an even more powerful backstab. Kender. Nah, the dwarf should get this one. I have one already, and besides, it fits their character better. All this was followed by silence from the DM. The look of shock and confusion on DM's face persists in my mind. DM tried a few more times to convince the party to give the new girdle to Kender, but Kender stood firm. They weren't taking the new girdle. It should go to the dwarf. DM finally relented, and we moved on to our next encounter. A town was being terrorized by a giant lizard-like monster. The party raced to the town's aid, and amazingly, it was the monster, not the party, which was surprised. Each of the players unleashed their full fury onto the beast. Even Kender skipped the sneak behind plans, as the beast had to be slain now. And the beast fell without even getting a turn. DM just stared at their notes, silence. And then DM feebly said, "You just killed the Tarrasque in one turn." The session ended, and DM was not happy. All the next week, DM was seen talking to other gamers about power creep and balancing games, so we knew something was up. Our next session began with the party receiving their next quest, and we all headed out down the forest road. As we were on the forest road, DM turns to Druid. DM. As you walk down the forest road, you feel the ground give beneath you, and you fall into a hole in the ground. It is a giant skunk lair. The skunk turns around and sprays you. Make a saving throw for each of your items to see if it survives. Druid. What? DM. You've been sprayed by a giant skunk. Make a saving throw for each of your items to see if it survives. Druid. But I'm a druid, walking down a road, in a forest. DM. So? Druid. Druids are a nature-based class. Don't I even get a check to see if I noticed the hole in the road? DM. No. Druid. Do I even have a chance to charm the animal or speak with it? DM. No. Make the saves. And so, Druid lost half of their equipment to a natural animal in the forest, without a chance to do anything about it. When the party reached the next town, the Druid called the party together and informed them that he needed to go back to the forest. He handed out all of his magical items to the party members who could best use them, calmly told the DM exactly how silly it was to use a giant skunk to target the Druid, and left the table. The session ended, and DM tried not to look smug in the awkward silence that had fallen. I thought a lot about what had happened in that campaign to date, and the direction things seemed to be headed. At the beginning of the next session, I announced to the party that my dwarf was tired of the outside world, and planned to return to the mountain halls of his people. I gave out most of my magic items, and left the game as well. Druid and I later heard that DM skunked several other characters that session, depriving them of levels and magic items, through improbable circumstances, which called for unavoidable saving throws. A giant skunk wasn't actually used again, but the general tactic was called skunking by a player for the rest of the year. Skunkings became a weekly thing in that game, until a few weeks later when DM skunked Kender, and what was left of the campaign folded. TLDR, Novice DM burns down their own campaign by playing favorites, forcing a character to be the main PC, and arbitrarily skunking characters for balance adjustment. Well, I'm not surprised that game fell apart after all of that. That DM was certainly petty in the fact that he couldn't stand that the party actually worked together by sharing loot amongst themselves, which he intended for one quote-unquote main character. And then it turned into vindictiveness when he decided to just strip things away from basically every player because of it. If anything, in regards to the skunk, and if I was the DM of that whole encounter, I would have given the druid a shot at taming the giant skunk, and then having it as some sort of a mount. Just imagine the terror on their enemies' faces when they see that charging towards them. Talk about needing gallons of tomato juice. Anyways, let's move on to the next one. I had a player weaponize their autism. Submitted to the d&Ddoge subreddit by Reddit user Rivers Twisted. So, I was watching some D&D Horror Story videos, and one story reminded me of a story that happened to me a few years ago. The story revolves around a player that I will name Megan. Megan did not last particularly long in the group, but she left an impact. This all really starts with conversations a few of the players were having one night before session, and involves another player named Ian. I and Ian were talking about his character, and how his backstory involved a group of religious people that I referred to as a cult. Ian was saying that he doesn't really like the word cult since it has negative connotations. I didn't really see the issue when referring to this group as a cult. I was at the time studying ancient Greek mythology in university, so cult just meant a religious group to me. Either way, I agreed not to use the term since Ian didn't like it. Megan didn't understand Ian's issue with the word cult and tried to argue about how cult doesn't have any inherent negative meaning. The topic had already been resolved, so I was like, we don't need to keep talking about it. Let's just get on with the session. Megan was not okay with us moving past the topic and began to have a freak out and left the voice call. It took a solid half hour of messaging to get her to come back, and essentially Megan had an issue with the fact that we wouldn't let her speak, and the fact that we were silencing her as an autistic person was very upsetting and triggering. The entire rest of the group was dumbfounded and didn't really know how to respond, and just kind of went, sorry? She forgave us, and we were able to finally start the session. If this is where it ended, it would have just been a one-off weird thing that happened, but unfortunately, it didn't end there. A while later, the party was trying to figure out how to handle breaching into a building that was the bad guys' HQ. They had managed to successfully track and sneak up to the building without being caught, so they had virtually as much time as they wanted to come up with a good plan, so long as they didn't get themselves noticed or caught. The party spent the next hour going through the possible scenarios and ideas, and were actually coming up with a really good plan that I, as the DM, was like, if they get lucky with some rolls, they could actually pull this off. Damn. Sadly, all this planning, and it was actually a good plan, like dropping the veil, it would have worked. Megan had completely checked out during the planning, and then suddenly was like, so what's the plan? The party explained it to her, and her face scrunched as it clearly went over her head. Rather than ask for clarification, she goes, okay, whatever, and just charges through a window, and the whole situation goes to shit. When the party yells at her about what the fuck just happened, she gets really defensive and blames the party. Apparently, it was the party's fault for poorly explaining the plan to her. One of the other players that I'll name Henry annoyingly states that if she had been paying attention to the party planning, she would have understood the plan. Megan got very upset at this and starts calling the player ableist. Apparently, it's not okay to expect her to pay attention to, quote, stupid and boring shit like the party sitting around and talking about what to do, since she's autistic. It's not her fault she can't stay engaged, and the fact that we're getting upset at her for, as she claims, being autistic is incredibly offensive. This is where I admittedly probably reacted kind of poorly. As someone with ADHD and attention problems, her hiding behind a disability really pissed me off, and I told her off. I yelled at her that she's being a piece of shit, actively fucking up the party's plans because she couldn't be asked to pay attention and participate, and the fact that she had the gall to be, "But I'm autistic, so you have to forgive me," was not okay. She was appalled by this and accused me of being a bigot and also a transphobe. She was also trans, but that didn't have any relevance to anything. I told her I didn't give a shit if she was trans or autistic. It's not an excuse to be a piece of shit, and I booted her from the Discord. Since she was in another general tabletop Discord that the whole party was in, she started messaging anyone and everyone she could about how I was a monster and a bigot who banned her for being disabled and trans. She labels me as anti-LGBTQ, despite me being very openly bisexual. Also, she was saying that Henry was transphobic and how he hates trans people because he is secretly a closeted trans person. He is not. Most people didn't really believe her, but a few people sent me concerned messages about what was happening, and I told them what was going on and how the best advice I can give is to just block her. She then added me in the general chat of the Discord, trying to drag everyone into it, and this is when she got temp muted by the mods of the Discord. She left the Discord, and luckily, I haven't heard hide nor hair of her since. Odds are, she's out there, telling people about how she was a victim and unfairly attacked for her disabilities to whoever will listen. TLDR, player has a meltdown over not being able to continue someone else's argument, and also fails to pay attention to the party's plans, and tries to deflect all blame on being autistic. I angrily call her out on her BS, and she labels me an ableist bigot and anti-LGBTQ, and has a full-blown meltdown spanning multiple Discord servers. Another example of someone using their identity as a weapon against valid criticism. I really do hate it when that happens, as it only belittles cases where ableism and bigotry actually take place. The party being upset that Megan ruined all of their planning just because she couldn't be bothered to pay attention is not them piling on her due to her autism. And then to accuse the DM of being a bigot comes way out of left field, as nothing in the interactions had anything to do with her identity in any way. Though, it did sound like OP could have approached the issue with a bit more tact. Anyway, at least it sounds like OP hasn't had to deal with this whole ordeal since, and hopefully they were able to get their game back on track, and maybe even rewind so the party can put their plan into action. And by the looks of it, we have a bit more time. So what do you think about a short bonus story? How about you, Nipsey?
Yay, a bonus story. I really like this banana.
Well, you heard him. So let's get right into it. DMPC has Holy Avenger at level 2. We kill him and take it for ourselves, and the DM quits. By Reddit user Mediocre Cucumber 65. Horror from all sides that accumulates in everybody losing. In our first session, we almost TBK from goblins. At the end of that session, we level up and arrive at the town where a paladin NPC joins us. The DM says, "I'll help you out since it looks like you're having a rough time." Our next mission is to infiltrate a zombie bandit hideout under an abandoned mansion. At first, it looks like another near TPK with the bandits hitting pretty hard, but then the DMPC pulls out his holy sword and smites everything in sight. Out of character, I know this is the Holy Avenger. I have a talk about how OP this is for level 2, and the DM says, "Well, do you not want the help?" As expected, the DMPC paladin shines every fight, and we feel like backup dancers. This keeps going on until level 3, where we're all annoyed by this point. During the night, we plot to steal the sword. We stab the DMPC in his sleep, and the DM says, "PvP is not allowed. You can't murder Hobo your ally and steal his sword. I don't want to continue DMing for you guys anymore." Yeah, OP wasn't lying when they said that there was horror all around on this one. The DM making encounters impossible until his main character NPC comes in to save the day, and then the plot to kill the DMPC to take the sword. It sounds like this campaign was doomed from the start. Do you have a story about some Dungeons & Dragons woe that you would like to be shared on the channel? If so, be sure to post it in the comments below, on the d&Ddoge subreddit, or even feel free to contact me on Twitter. As always, I appreciate all of you, and may all of your rolls be natural 20s. Until next time.